Sometimes accidents just happen, and what do I mean by accidents in the hobby community? Well, it can be everything from bumping into your friend at a gaming event and knocking a model off a table. It can be as simple as squeezing a little too hard when you pick up a model that has wings and maybe you snap them off, or it could just be you're trying to clean out the display case and a model takes a tumble. How do we fix that? Well, there's a few different really good ways that we can fix that. Number one, you can use super glue, and we're going to talk about that really briefly. Number two, which this is a slightly better way, you can use a mixture of green stuff and super glue, or if it's possible and the pieces are large enough to use a metal pin, number three, we use a metal pin. And today we're going to be showing you exactly how to pin your miniatures, which is one of the best ways to do that. But we're also going to be talking about sculpting with green stuff and how to kind of blend everything together. Now, if you don't know what green stuff is, it's basically two-part plumbing epoxy, but it dries a little bit slower and it has the same consistency of plastic, meaning that you can carve it with a knife once it's dry. So let's take a second to talk about all that. So I want to apologize for the shaky camera. I had recorded this for another social media, but I thought that the image on screen was a really good example of a worst case scenario. This miniature had been abandoned at my shop. I found most of him in a trash can, and I actually found the rest of him scattered throughout the gaming space. I think it had taken a tumble off the table, and when the game was done being played, the thought that this model had basically just been destroyed was a bit too much for whoever had owned it, and they just decided to get rid of it. I took it home and I kind of fixed up the main body issues, which is what you're seeing on screen now. It had been primed in gold with a little bit of paint, and then everything else was just as busted as you see. There were several parts on this model that appeared to have been at one point affixed with super glue, which seemed to indicate that it had broken a few times before and had been repaired, and perhaps this time when it broke, all the original repairs broke as well as new parts. Those wings had definitely been super glued on at one point, and they're so delicate by comparison to anything else on the model. I definitely understand why someone would just get frustrated if they kept breaking. But we're going to use a metal pin on those to fix those, and we'll talk about that in just a moment. So typically when we're working with miniatures, our most common breaks are going to be the weapons that are on hands, especially hands with wrists that are abnormally small. In the case of these models here, these are Night Haunt models. They are basically an undead ghostly type creature. They have very thin wrists, and we can't really put a metal pin in these. So we need a way that'll strengthen the model that isn't just using super glue, because as I've said, if you just super glue something, odds are if it takes another tumble, it's going to break exactly where the super glue was. So although super glue is a great temporary fix, especially if you're out at a tournament, you can just kind of knock out that fix right away, right then and there, and not really have to worry about it. However, if you're at home and you have the ability to fix things proper, if it's a small miniature like this, something that you can do is that you can just glue it in place with a tiny bit of super glue. And then in my case, I made a little shackle out of green stuff and just wrapped it around the wrist over the break. And that acted as a reinforcement. And that wrist will probably never break again now that I've got that green stuff on there. And if it does, odds are it will break where the super glue is, and it'll act like an area that I can just fill up with glue, like a little pocket, and I can slip the wrist back onto where it was supposed to be. But if it's large enough to use a metal pin, this is how you do a metal pin. So this is our original piece here. This is with all the pieces back in place. I've put metal pins in the wings, but we're just going to be talking about this little flame bit. It's going to do the best job I can do at explaining how to metal pin something and not have to be fighting the camera the whole way. It just mounts in on the back right there, and there's two different places it mounts in at. Now we could use one metal pin and a little bit of super glue, but I'm worried that it'll kind of break free, so we're going to actually be using two metal pins, one in each side, and we're just going to mount it together the best that we can. First things first, we want to inspect the break. We want to see if it's a clean break, or if it's not, can it fit back together exactly how it came across. Now it appears that whoever had this model last did their best job to kind of blend things in so that they didn't need to glue things back together where it started. That's absolutely fine. We're just going to come in with an X-Acto knife and real slow we're going to cut that off, and we're going to make it flush and flat, and then if there's any space left over, we'll fill that with green stuff once everything's mounted. And then what we're going to do is I like to score the flat area because we're going to need to drill into this. Now you can start with a pilot hole like you see me doing here. I'm not applying any pressure, I'm just lightly spinning it back and forth right in between, right at the corners of that X right in the middle, and we're just making a small little hole. This is going to help our pin vise to take grip and to go exactly where we want it to. That way we don't have to worry about it just kind of sliding around on the surface and making a bit of a mess, or not even necessarily drilling a straight hole right in the middle. You can get a little tool like this from most hobby supply places. They're called a pin vise, and basically what they are for is they're a tiny little drill that you can do by hand to actually cut holes into your miniatures. There's also a lot of companies that make electric versions. I happen to use some drill bits that are also meant for a CNC machine. They've got a nice little large area for me that get a good grip on them. However, they are very fragile and they're kind of expensive. If you drop one off a table, it's probably going to break, whereas if you drop this off a table, it's less likely to break. When picking out drill bits for doing this kind of work, we want to pick out something that's about the same size as a paper clip. Now, if you don't want to use a paper clip, you can use metal wire. Just pick out a drill bit that's appropriate. Don't go with anything that is thicker than half the thickness of what you're drilling into. So if you're trying to pin a wrist or something like that, don't pick anything too large because you can actually blow out the hole, whereas that means to say you will just tear the model to pieces. Also, be aware of how deep you're drilling. Every now and again, pull the drill bit out, put your finger where it was before you pull the drill bit out, and then line that up with the outside of the model. That's going to give you a really good idea of how much depth you've gone into this model with. In my case, I know that I can pretty much drill all the way into this thing and it's not going to be the end of the world for me, so I'm not super concerned about that. And you should only have to drill about 1/4 of an inch into the model to put a pin in there to hold everything together, unless it's something huge like Mortarian's wings. You should only ever really need to go about 1/4 of an inch at the most. Now it's time to pin our metal rod. Now we want to pick a rod that's roughly about double the length of the hole that we've drilled, so that way when we drill the hole on the other piece, it should come pretty close to fitting in. So we're just going to go ahead and we're going to put some super glue on that metal pin. You can do it the way that I did it, or you can apply it directly out of the bottle. The way I do it is a little less messy, and then we just want to give it a chance to dry. While that dries, we want to go ahead and drill our holes on the other half of the miniature just to get everything ready to go. Now there's a bit of a trick to make sure that both pins sit in there properly, and that is one hole needs to be slightly larger than the other. This is going to give you some wiggle room. But we're going to go ahead and we're going to put a little bit of super glue on the top of each hole. Make sure that you do a test fit before you start putting glue on your model. I didn't record that, but it's something you want to do. And then we're just going to real carefully insert our piece into those holes. You may want to wiggle it around a little bit before the glue sets just to make sure the glue gets all up in everything and holds it together, and then we're just going to leave it to dry. Now, no matter how many times I attempted to record this, the autofocus on any of the cameras I used just kind of kept causing problems, so I really do apologize about this. I couldn't think of a better way to record this. But basically we want to get a small portion of our green stuff. Again, this is 2-part plumbing epoxy basically, and we just want to get a small little piece, and we can either use a silicone tool or a metal tool or even toothpicks. And as long as our working tools or our fingers are wet, it's not really going to stick to things. And we're just going to go ahead and we're going to mush these into any holes, and we're going to do our best to sculpt it to match the surrounding area. Now we don't have to go crazy with this, we just want to try to fill that gap, and if we do a good job at filling the gap and there's some excess left over, you can get in there with an X-Acto knife and cut it away before it hardens, and you should be fine. So as you guys can see, he's all back in one piece. It's nice and solid, and I'll even pick it up by that piece. I would never do this with super glue. His wings were pinned doing the exact same thing. I would never do that with super glue. I would only trust metal pins to hold my model back together. As you can see, metal pins make a massive difference when it comes to the structural strength of your miniatures, and if you can put a metal pin in to save your mini and to put it back together, you should always try to put a metal pin in. Now something that we didn't get to cover with that is trying to sculpt, right? So we want to take a moment to talk about sculpting details back in and how you would fix much bigger gaps. So I have a model that I 3D printed. It's a bust, her hair is printed as a different piece, and it clamshells together and it didn't line up properly. So as you guys can see here, there's a rather large gap here, especially down around the bottom of the neck there. Now I have filled a few spots with super glue, but I try not to go all the way up to the surface. This is just to eliminate how much product I'm actually shoving into the crack and crevice of this misshapen model. So I'm going to be using silicone scraper tools and shaper tools. These are just special tools that don't stick to green stuff. And as long as you keep them damp or wet, it should be fine. I'm actually just using the edge of my wet palette off screen to keep the tools wet. Just like Mortarion, you can see me here, I'm just kind of mushing it into the cracks and crevices, trying to fill that gap as best as I can. And we'll do this a little bit all over, and then we'll come back in and we'll talk about how I actually sculpt and shape things to match the hairline. So once you've done a good job at kind of filling that gap, we want to go ahead and smooth out the surfaces both into the sculpted hair and into the skin line. This is just to kind of smooth things out and get things ready to start adding in all of that detail. One of the first things I like to do, I like to go in and add any lines. Now in this case the hair is almost entirely made out of lines, so we're just going to be using a straight line scraper tool, and we're just going to go in and we're going to dab the surface. We're basically similar to how we made dry brush. We dab the surface. Then I come in with a harder tool. In this case I'm using a toothpick, and I'm following those existing lines that are already in the hair, and I'm really dragging out those shapes. Now it's okay if we end up roughing up the putty by doing this. We're just trying to get the deepest grooves here and really start to set that detail in place. Next we want to start thinking about how this blends into the skin and the rest of the scalp. So this is where we start working on our vertical as opposed to our horizontal movements. You can see me here, I'm just fixing a few little spots that had some issues, but for the most part we're just trying to kind of flatten things out and blend it in with the surface. If we end up pushing a little bit too much in one direction, we can cut that away with an X-Acto knife like we did before, and then just go back in and re-smooth out the surface. Well, I had some high spots here, and you can see I'm basically just rolling it back and forth. What this does is it leaves all those nice valleys that connect in with all the hair texture, but it just brings down those high peaks and makes the detail a little softer. Now because this sculpt doesn't have crazy sculpted hair, that's why we want softer details. This is just some of the things that you should keep in mind when working with green stuff or gray stuff or whatever product you decide to use for filling gaps. Just know that depending on what type of products you use are entirely going to depend on how much time you have for sculpting. In my opinion, I would rather have more than enough time for sculpting and let it sit overnight than to have barely any time at all just so that I can start painting the same day. With all that in mind though, we need to let this one dry, as I was working on this one today, so there will not be a prime job on this, but I will leave you with a few close-ups here at the end so you can see a bit of a better idea of what I ended up getting left with. But for the most part, I hope you guys will understand. If there are questions about how I would go about fixing certain things or repairing certain things, please leave those in the comments, and then as soon as I have the ability to make a video on those, I will make a video on those specifically for you guys. Just right now I wasn't really sure what kinds of topics you wanted me to talk about, and these were the two biggest projects that I thought would be the easiest to record to make this kind of a video, so hopefully you guys understand. But here we are with the final product. Yeah, I know that this isn't a painting video, which we've done nothing but painting videos so far. Also, I understand that there's a lot of green on the model. That's me using liquid green stuff to kind of fill some other gaps. We've already done a video talking about that on the channel before when it came to how to smooth out 3D prints, which is why we didn't really talk about it in today's video. But as you can see there, that hairline really blends in really well with the rest of the hair. I'm really proud of how it turned out. Hopefully you guys have learned something through watching this video. It was always my intention to kind of share information that I learned along the way when it came to this channel, and this is just me doing that. This is me attempting to share what I know and teach what I know. So although it's not a painting video like normal, hopefully you guys took something away from this, and hopefully you guys found this video interesting. As always, thank you guys so much for the love and support that you've shown this channel and my other social medias. I am very, very grateful for all the love and support. But, as always, I hope your display case is always full and your pile of shame never runs empty. Until next time, guys.